Shayna Magnuson is from Toronto, Canada, and she started, oh yay. She started practicing martial arts, beginning with Shotokan Karate when she was 6 years old. And she's dabbled in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, and now she's training in MMA, which she's gonna tell us about tonight. Shayna has also loved theater for almost as long as she's been involved in fighting sports, and she's part of the amateur performance and theater scene, including the next Tokyo International Players show in 1 month. So, give it up for Shayna.
Clicky button. Oh, ooh, whoa, I'm loud. Okay. Yay, okay. Hi, guys. Sorry, I'm going to use some notes just to help me push through and deal with this time limit that we've got today. Hello, my name is Shayna. And in terms of my background, it was kind of mentioned already, but yes, I've been training in different martial arts since I was 6 years old. I've trained in karate, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, Muay Thai, wrestling, and currently MMA, which is, can anybody tell me what MMA stands for? Yes, thank you. Okay, you're like one step ahead of me already. I currently study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA at a dojo in Tachikawa under this guy, who is my head teacher. I've trained in Canada, Brazil, China, and Japan, and I've competed in the World Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Championships in Brazil when I was 15 years old. My dad was also an MMA manager for some Canadian professional fighters when I was training as a child. And when I was younger, MMA was still relatively young as well in North America. So I've basically grown up with and around MMA, and it's always been a part of my life. Alrighty, so if any of you happen to listen to the preview for this talk, I apologize in advance. I actually won't be speaking about the art side of mixed martial arts today, maybe some other time. Instead, due to the time constraints, I'm going to just focus on trying to establish a basic understanding of the often misrepresented sport that is MMA, and to address some of the simple but pervasive misconceptions that exist. I did a quick scan for cauliflower ears a few minutes ago, so if anybody is the proud owner of hair, I apologize as well that you might not find this very edifying, but thank you for coming if you're out there. Otherwise, let's get started. So I've whittled it down from 8 points to 4. I know that's not a very exciting number, but there we go. So I'm gonna work my way down, and here we go. Number 4, MMA is human cockfighting. All right. In a rather timely coincidence, North Americans largely have this guy, Senator Kane, to thank for this quote and for spreading this connotation of MMA. Right off the bat, I mean, comparing the torture and death of non-human animals to the legal, consensual display of sportsmanship in MMA is very unfair and inaccurate, to say the least. MMA fighters are consenting adults. Some commissions do allow children to compete under modified rules, but again, they're not animals, usually. Fighters make the big boy, big girl decision to get into the ring and fight or not. Of course, underground illegal fighting organizations do exist, and of course, these places can involve gang-run activity, gambling, rigging, etc. This is just like any other illegal sport or any other illegal activity. There's really nothing new to say about that here. Some people take issue with the seemingly barbaric image of having fighters compete in cages like they do in the UFC, as opposed to a ring, which the organization called Pride used to use in Japan, or under. By the way, I will be mentioning the UFC a lot today. The UFC is not the same thing as MMA. UFC stands for Ultimate Fighting Championships. It's an organization that was created in the 90s, and it's basically responsible for the growth of MMA in North America. Anyways, UFC uses a cage as opposed to a ring. Whoop, 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 whoop. Click happy there. And some people think that this makes the fighters basically look like animals, but actually the UFC's thought is that if you're in a real fight, you will probably have barriers around you, which will affect the techniques that you can use. For example, when a guy is pressed up against a cage on the ground, it can be harder to submit him, but also his or her mobility is greatly reduced. On the other hand, having a ring is supposed to give the fighters more room to execute moves, but there's more stop and start and a lot of position loss when refs have to interfere. Personally, I prefer a cage environment, but everybody has their own preferences. All right, this human cockfighting connotation also leads people to think that there are no rules. Sure, when you're talking about creation or vale tudo, yes, the rules are very few and far between, but MMA rules have evolved from this very rapidly, and that's just for safety reasons, but also because of how boring it is to basically just sit around waiting for the first guy to get, kicked in the junk. So now there's something called the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, which is the most prevalent rule set currently being used worldwide. Fights that are sanctioned by the state athletics commissions are legally obligated to enforce strict health and safety requirements. This means that there are weight classes, there are blood tests, there are referees that have been licensed and trained, there are, the professional MMA athletes are examined by doctors before, during, and after a fight. If an athlete is found to have an injury before a fight, they will not be allowed to compete. In addition, if a fighter is injured during a competition, even if they win, they will be given medical suspensions prohibiting them from competing and from contact in training for a designated amount of time or until they're cleared again by a physician. There are also specific rules about steroid use and extremely strict testing procedures in organizations that don't allow them at all, like the UFC. The list of rules goes on. As you can see, the rules dictate things like how your hands are wrapped, what kind of protective equipment you're wearing as a male or a female, your hygiene, including things like how short are your fingernails or how long are your fingernails, etc. And this is just regarding the organization of the fights themselves. Then there's what actually happens in the ring. Rules here include no groin attacks, no headbutts, no small joint manipulations. You can't grab the ring or the cage. You cannot throw your opponent out of the ring or the cage because this is not professional wrestling. Finally, while a lot of people think that the fights tend to end just with knockouts, there are also technical knockouts, TKOs, which is basically when a ref or a doctor interferes when they say one opponent cannot intelligently defend themselves anymore. It's done for safety reasons. Submissions are extremely popular. It can also go to a decision where the judges decide based on a certain point system. You can be disqualified, you can forfeit, and there's something called a no contest, which is a little bit complicated, don't have time to get into it, but as you can see, there are lots of rules in legal MMA fights. All right, still, however, when it's not being accused of being human cockfighting, a lot of people go in the polar opposite direction and say, it's like pro wrestling, it's all rigged, it's all fake. Okay, so the BS of this statement is apparent from the fact that you can see the direct financial repercussions of unexpected losses. It's just not business savvy for some of these fights to play out the way that they do. There are many examples of this, but one that comes to mind is from a few years ago in women's mixed martial arts after a really popular female champion lost in devastating fashion, and the title was then passed around and around to other women who just couldn't defend the title. A lot of the fans got bored with this, as they tend to do, and you could see that the commissioner was kind of freaking out about losing his money-making hero, so that didn't go the way as planned. As far as business is concerned as well, the payouts for big organizations are often available for public viewing. And with no union currently in place, MMA fighters often only make a small percentage of the whole revenue brought in by these organizations. This is a little bit of a deviation, but there's this image that's spread through certain kinds of media and through really crappy movies that push this trope of like, get rich fast by beating up that guy in the ring and then you win all the money from the gangsters. Also, someone once told me very confidently that the only reason my MMA teacher would be so supportive of my training is so that he could eventually make money off of my fights by, cashing in on that 20% managerial cut. So, I mean, you can see the numbers for yourselves. This is over at Invicta FC, which is the biggest all-female organization in existence right now, which I'd never be able to get into. The defending champion recently walked away with $12,000, okay? Half of that was a bonus. Down at the bottom, you see Sarah Click went home with $1,000 for her troubles. Most of these fighters, on top of their prep time, their dieting, their training regime, they're working second jobs. One of my favorite female competitors from this organization is a radiologist in her spare time. Even in the UFC, which is the biggest organization in existence right now, you've got people like Mark De La Rosa walking away with $12,000 for a fight. With a median annual salary of $42,000, UFC fighters, who are the best of the best, make about as much as a middle-grade office worker, with a lot more risk and out-of-pocket professional expenses involved. But to bring this back to the point about rigging, to suggest that fighters are getting paid under the table to lose and are constantly and about their low pay is basically conspiracy theory silliness. Also, rigged fights, as far as technique is concerned, are painfully obvious. One way to spot a fake fight is when it actually starts to look like wrestling. Okay, so I'm gonna have a look at a couple of examples, starting on the left. I hope this works. We've got a skilled freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestler named Mark Coleman. Is a famous professional wrestler named Takada. Coleman is everything power right now to not actually hurt Takada or even hit him with these punches. Takada goes ahead with his signature pro wrestling heel hook, and Coleman does a kind of pro wrestler flail. Like, this is a pro wrestler, this is the fight. Okay, he taps out, this is pro wrestling. Just to show the comparison, it's pretty obvious. Coleman did later blatantly admit that he had been paid to lose that fight. Okay, second example, if you please. Another way to fix a fight is to have the ref basically decide in advance that he's not going to do his job and stop the fight when it needs to be stopped. I should, it's a little late now, but I wanted to warn you there's a lot of contact in this video. Please note that this is not actually what a lot of MMA fights look like, because nobody is actually supposed to be allowed to take that amount of abuse in an MMA fight. Funny story here is that we've got a Russian fighter named Emelianenko fighting at home in Russia, and the judges and the referee in charge of the bout were employees of the Russian MMA union, whose president is Emelianenko, who's the fighter, okay? So he went on to win, yay! And then it was overturned because, for real? Okay, so that's another way of rigging a fight. I actually had a brush with a blatant rigging attempt during my time in China, which happens all the time in China, which is one of the reasons why China's not a big MMA country. Obviously, I turned that fight down. So now, that being said, this is not, nope, next slide. Yay, thank you. Oh, nope. There we go. That's not to say that the management side of things at the promoter and the matchmakers level doesn't influence which matches and the way that the matches unfold. The closest thing to rigging that exists are intentional mismatches and preferential treatment. Low-tier fighters are sometimes coerced into fighting someone who is actually way more skilled than they'll let on. Even big-time promotions like the UFC have been accused of taking care of certain fighters more than others, or offering certain fighters more opportunities for high-level fights or rematches. They'll also pressure some people to retire, or maybe like not to retire if they're making a lot of money. After all, it is business. Okay, now moving on. Whew, okay, if I had a hack win for every time I heard this next one, I'd be richer than the atomweight Invicta FC champion, yay. Okay. I'm not kidding, okay? I've never really dignified this comment with an answer before, but hey, I'm wearing a microphone and there's an audience, so here we go. One obvious way to respond to this is, right? Because obviously this says way more about the person saying it than it does about the sport itself. Another way to respond is to mention how while this sort of casual immaturity that smacks of homophobia may seem rather innocuous coming from somebody who's like never been to a dojo, it's also something that's said a lot and used by particularly nasty, ignorant stand-up fighters, particularly boxers, who don't have a clue about ground fighting. On a personal level, when you're often the only female practicing with men who are like twice your size and strength, it becomes a little bit exhausting wondering if your training partners are there to like actually train with you, or if some of the noobs who like currently have their legs wrapped around your face have the same infantile, overly sexualized image of the moves that they're supposed to be practicing with you. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it, obviously, because these kinds of people just don't tend to last long in a dojo setting. But you'll forgive me if I fail to see the humor in these comments and find them a little bit tiresome, shall we say. Yet another way to address this statement, though, is to make brief mention of the fact that the UFC actually has a relatively large number of out gay fighters, including we've got Tisha Torres, Raquel Pennington, Jessica Andrade, who I freaking love, Liz Carmouche, Nina Ansarov, and probably most famously, we've got Amanda Nunes, who is currently the reigning UFC women's bantamweight champion, and she's actually engaged to Nina on the left. It feels really weird and unnecessary and inappropriate to like have to put these people up on a slide and be like, hey, check this out. But unfortunately, as that quote would dictate, that's the world we live in now. So actually, yes, MMA is in fact a very gay sport compared to others at the moment. And I only hope that more fighters in the men's division and more sports in general will follow suit. But ultimately, when people make this comment, it turns out that what many of them are actually trying to say is, it's boring. Okay, I know metaphors and analogies are not everybody's forte, but there we go. So let's break this down. Basically, there are 4 ranges of fighting, which are all utilized in MMA. Which is different from most traditional martial arts, which tend to focus on only 1 or 2 ranges. While the audiences and judges tend to prefer the punching and kicking ranges, many find that the trapping and the grappling ranges are less entertaining. In fact, it's very common to hear audiences booing when the fights go to the ground. Again, if these fights were rigged, you think that that would be avoided altogether, but I digress. However, pretty much every real fight will wind up on the ground at some point. And some of the most important techniques that can determine the outcome of a fight take place in the trapping and the grappling positions. So let's have a look at an example. From the get-go, okay. We've got a really, really amazing wrestler on the left-hand side. He's from Canada, woohoo! And we've got a Muay Thai fighter on the right-hand side. You can see that the Muay Thai guy is a little more upright. He's lighter on his feet, which makes it really easy for the wrestler to take him down again and again and again and again, as continued to happen during this 25-minute fight. It's pretty awesome. Okay. The Muay Thai guy, he shows he's got a little bit of jiu-jitsu training because he goes for a triangle choke. Unfortunately, he's a little too high up on the back of his neck, so the wrestler can shake it off really easily, get into something called side control. This doesn't feel good when you're on the bottom. It's really hard to breathe from down here. The guy on the top wants to either pass into the mounted position, but the guy on the bottom is using his legs, so he can't go around his legs, which means he either has to go around the head or he's going to use knee on belly, take the back, which is a really good position as well. Unfortunately, he falls off the top, so he goes for a leg lock instead, switches the leg lock into a takedown in a moment, goes for it, woo, and he rides that momentum back up into a more dominant top-down position, which wrestlers are really good at, so he's perfectly comfortable to stay there. Fast forward a couple of rounds, he's back in side control. Again, he wants to go for an arm lock. Again, this gets a little bit cringy if you don't want to watch, I totally understand. He's almost got this this arm lock, which again, you can't do it by stepping around the legs. He's almost got it here. He's thinking about tapping. That other hand is like, ow! He's almost got it, but this dude must be like double jointed or something because this is really abnormal. Most people would have tapped. George is on top. He's like looking at his corner like, help, what do I do? This is not normal. Okay, he goes back into side control, like forget it. You don't want to like wear out your grip. So he's doing what a wrestler does. He's going to grab between the legs and hold onto the guy's hips, which is the way that you control their center of gravity. So there's a reason for doing that. He's holding onto his hips. If you control the guy's center of gravity, he can't go anywhere. He can't knock you off. He can't twist out of it. So basically, the point of that is to show that there is a reason for every single awkward-looking move that you do on the ground, whether it's going for a submission or controlling the guy's center of gravity. Ultimately, what you want to do when you're on the ground is submit the guy, and wrestlers in particular are very good at doing that. Alrighty, so last point, and it's a big one. Brace yourselves. It's the most dangerous sport. Hate to break it to you guys, but it's not exactly the case, okay? Contrary to popular belief, international statistics currently show that elite athletes competing in MMA are less likely to attain serious injuries than in a range of other contact sports, such as ice hockey, boxing, and American football. And actually, we've already looked at some of the key reasons for this. First of all is the schedule. Due to the intensity of the sport, a professional MMA athlete only competes 1 to 3 bouts a year. Meanwhile, other sports like hockey or football have more games per week, spanning more than half of the year. Even in pro wrestling, you come across guys who have like a signature flying headbutt move that they have to perform multiple times every show. Shows that take place 4 or 5 times a week, for instance. That's just not healthy. It's not good for you. Meanwhile, over in MMA, headbutts are illegal, okay? Also, the level of intensity that people train at really varies from gym to gym and from fighter to fighter. Not everyone responds equally to the same level or the same type of fight prep. So there's a huge amount of variety in terms of the kind of damage people take during their training camps. Second are the regulations. I mean, we've already looked at the sheer number of rules that exist, many of which exist for and revolve around fighter safety. This includes the option to submit rather than having to be TKO'd or KO'd, which you see in boxing and Muay Thai. This also includes regulations surrounding the equipment and the gloves used. For instance, boxing gloves. I mean, is all that weight and padding, is it to protect your opponent, or is it to protect your hand so that you can hit your opponent harder and so that they don't cut, so that the fights can go on for longer? I'll let you figure that one out. Finally, has to do with the sport itself. Arguably, the most important reason is that there are relatively few freak accidents or unexpected things that can happen during an MMA fight. No one is going to get into the ring and suddenly invent a move that another person has never seen before. MMA fighters are therefore extremely well prepared for what they're getting themselves into, and they come equipped offensively and defensively. This is compared to the possibilities, for instance, of being tackled in soccer, or falling off a horse when you're horse jumping, or being dropped on your head by your cheerleading squad. One reason that serious injuries are relatively low in MMA is because it's a sport where you are prepared and trained for impact, not where your key task is something else, but you might accidentally get injured or killed in the process. At the end of the day, it says a lot about MMA that numerous athletes will retire from careers in American football, soccer, gymnastics, and they will retire into mixed martial arts for the second win. These are just a small sample of the very successful MMA fighters who have done this. I won't bother with their names, but just for example. And I think I'm over time, so unfortunately, I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't really have a thesis statement, but I'd be happy to take some questions, and thank you so much for listening.
Questions for Shayna. Jens has a question. Please pass this back.
So, just wondering, but have you ever broken a bone or anything doing it?
Yes. Yes, I have. A couple of bones, nothing serious. I've broken a couple fingers, I've broken my hand. Probably the most annoying one that took a long time to heal was I cracked my shin, which took a long time to diagnose. It was just like a chronic pain, but it wasn't showing up on any major x-rays. So it took a couple of tries to like figure out what it actually was. They had to inject something to make me glow, apparently, and they're like, oh, your shin's cracked. And then there's nothing they can actually do, so I had to wear a brace, and I wasn't very popular in high school. Yeah.
But let's see someone tell you weren't popular.
Not to my face, no. It was just a general vibe, like, everybody left me alone. Here.
Do you have a question?
I do.
Okay, you have a mic.
I noticed that you put your theater up there too. Is there an interaction between your MMA experience and your theater? And if so, what is that? How does it work?
Oh, wow. That touches on exactly what I initially wanted to talk about. And I was like, oh, I'm going so far down the rabbit hole. I don't have time for this today. But yes, I do notice mentally some similarities in the way that you approach rehearsals and performances, actually. I mean, there's nerves involved. There's a whole bunch of risk-taking involved. Of course, the risks are slightly different. But what I find really interesting is that both activities offer, or they ask you questions. Like for in theater, whether it's the director asking you a question, the script, your scene partner, and then it's like, what are you going to do with that question? How are you going to answer that question? How are you going to use your creativity to turn that into something that people want to see or something successful? It's very similar in fighting. If you're fighting somebody, they've got a specific style. They're asking you questions, as it were. Okay, well, how are you going to counter that? How are you going to come out on top? And so there is a similarity, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks.
Pass that back and here's the mic.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay, cool. It might seem like a very simple question, but what do you like about doing MMA? Like, what is the thing that makes you like, I want to do more and I want to continue doing that?
About MMA in particular, I like being able to sort of combine all the different individual types of training that I've had in the past. So having a really amazing teacher right now who can guide me with that. He's extremely successful and experienced in MMA. He was a champion before. You can look him up. I won't get into it. But having somebody there to guide you to merge all these different things that you've done in different scenarios and turn them into one cohesive fighting style that's kind of based around who you are is really intriguing and makes me want to go back and develop that. In terms of just life, it just gives me I think it just gives me an interesting perspective, or slightly different perspective on going through my daily business, whether it's dealing with a really crowded commute or some people who are giving you a hard time or whatever. It's a very valuable life skill in general, I think.
Hey, question. So if you're prepping for a fight, like what does your training regimen look like for like the week, on a week basis going towards a fight?
Wow. I should preface that by saying I've never had a professional fight, so I've actually never gone through a full training camp. Any fights that I've had have always been very last minute. Hey, somebody dropped out. Do you want to take it next week? And it's all amateur. So, but that's interesting. What I do know for a fact is that you can't be having any other jobs at the time. It's a full-time job. So the people that I know who are professional fighters, they're 9 to 5, even more. So it's more like a 7 to 11. You get up and they have trainers who will basically create a training schedule for them. And take you through it. And it's like, okay, first thing you're going to do, you're going to go for an hour run, and then you're going to do like a little bit of cardio, then you're going to go to the weight gym, and you're going to do this, and then we'll work on grappling, and then you're going to have lunch, which is going to be this, and then you're going to come back and you're going to work on your stand-up, and then we'll do some wrestling, and and then you go to bed at this time, and it's a full job. Everything is scheduled, and what I have heard as well, that the intensity of that regimen will depend, or it'll change depending on who's actually preparing for the fight. So some people will kind of ramp it up right until the day of the fight, and there's other people who will kind of hit the peak about a week before and then let themselves kind of settle into it for the final week and just sort of coast until the actual fight, and that really depends on the individual. I hope that helps. I don't know.
I have a question over here.
Over
on your
here.
right.
Yes, hello.
Yes, holding the mic. You mentioned that your MMA training helps prepare you to deal with morning commutes. You probably have a very different interpretation than how I'm envisioning it. What did you mean?
I don't know, it might be similar. It's just, while everything screams to the contrary at the moment, I'm actually kind of an introverted person. I like my personal space. I like my bubble. I get really freaked out if somebody's in my personal space, which is just unavoidable sometimes in Japan. And then you hear stories, you have friends who have had certain negative experiences on the train. Luckily, hasn't happened, but you hear about these things, and unfortunately, that's just something that you mentally think about and you mentally prepare for it. Like, what would happen if this happens and stuff. So just the way that you're, aware of the people around you and the space around you, I think having that kind of training can help me more positively envision possible outs if something negative happened.
So you've never gotten to put someone in an arm bar on the Yamanote line?
Not yet, no. No, and it's not, luckily nothing's ever come to that,
I guess from your presentation, you have experience in several martial arts. Did you find any similarities in philosophies, or did you learn anything, something in common between those different martial arts?
Might sound a little bit trite, but the one thing that I think really ties them together, at least in my experience, has been the element of respect and humility. In dojos that are doing it right, you can't really get ahead in a martial art if you come in with like a massive ego, if you're not willing to tap out, if you're not willing to roll with this person because they're smaller than me or whatever. That environment really, really reinforces, it necessitates an element of humility and respect for the people you're training with, and respect for different skill levels, different body types, just differences in people. So in my experience, regardless of the dojo that I've been to, the good dojos that I've been to, that's one thing that they've all had in common, and that they really take seriously as well. If they find somebody not doing it, they'll call you on it, which is really appreciated. I see a hand.
Any final? Oh,
I see two hands.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, stranger.
You mentioned theater before.
I did.
Are you involved in any upcoming shows? Cough, cough.
Smooth. Yes, I am. Thank you for bringing that up. So Tokyo International Players is having a show. There's a couple people in here involved as well. The show is opening in October, mid-October. Does anyone have the actual dates? October 18th. Yeah, what she said. Yeah, so there's a theater show coming up, if anybody's into theater. I don't have any fights coming up, but if you want to see us do stuff on a stage elsewhere, that would be the place to do it. Yeah, it's going to be a really great show. If anybody's into Brecht, come check it out. Oh, yeah. It's called Good Person of Szechuan, if anybody's heard of it. Good Person of Szechuan by Tokyo International Players in October in Nakano.
So no beatdowns, but plenty of Brecht.
Actually, there's like a mini beatdown.
There's a mini beatdown.
There's a mini beatdown involving some furniture.
Go watch this show.
There's furniture and beatdowns. Yeah, it's gonna be good.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about, you said that MMA fighters don't really get paid a lot of money, and there's a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. So if you said that training camps are a full-time thing, so is this like, do they get sponsored to do the training?
That's a really good point. Sponsorship is actually a huge part of most fighters' incomes. The UFC, which again is the big organization, signed a kind of sketchy contract with Reebok not that long ago, where they were like, "Oh, you're not allowed to have any other sponsors now. We're just going with Reebok," and that made a lot of people angry, and a lot of fighters left and went to a different organization. It's a long story, and I don't actually have all the details, so I don't want to talk about stuff I don't know about. But yeah, sponsorship is a really huge part of it. I mean, keeping in mind that a lot of people train in the US, medical expenses are not cheap, which is like an issue for some fighters. I believe medical expenses are covered if you're injured like during a fight and whatnot, but some stuff that goes down during training may or may not be covered, depending on your dojo and also on your sponsorship. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That is a huge part of it.
final question up there. Yeah.
Hi. So in a lot of professional sports, obviously, male and female athletes are treated and paid quite differently. I was wondering, firstly, if that's the case with MMA, and also if any fights, amateur or pro, or like even in training, if there's any mixed training or mixed fights.
Right, so the first, about the payment, unfortunately, if you look at different organizations, like for example, the all-female organization, Invicta FC, which is like the big all-female organization, the pay is pretty sad compared to the bigger organizations. I don't necessarily say that it's just because it's female and it's not as popular. You can definitely see a difference in skill set as well. But again, that's largely because women haven't been allowed to do it for as long as men have. It's only been very recent that women were even allowed to enter the UFC, for instance, so they just haven't had as much time to develop. They're developing super quick now, though. Like, it's really impressive. It's really cool. So for the second bit about mixed fights, people have discussed it, or there's been like a bit of sort of like, yeah, I'll do it, and then it never happens. And I think at the moment it's just not allowed. It's quoted as being like a safety issue. They're just like, we can't really allow that. It does raise some really interesting questions, though. It might happen in the future. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting. There's a few female fighters who are outstanding, both in terms of skill and also just physicality. One woman that comes to mind, if anybody actually follows this, is Chris Cyborg. If anybody knows Chris Cyborg, like, she's just a very, very intimidating person. You guys can like Google a picture of her and check out who I'm talking about. Okay, like she's scary. And she's big. I think she fights at 145 pounds, which means she walks around at like 180. She's just like naturally a very, very big female, and so she could probably easily take some of the guys either in a similar weight division or lower. So there's been, like, people have talked about it. It hasn't happened yet, but it might in the future.
Okay. It's time for a break. So let's thank Shayna once again.
Thank you.